to another video. In this video, I will be creating a psychoanalysis into the mentality of a drug addict, which in understanding a drug addict, we then begin to understand the nature of the complexity at which these particular folks have created a complex, essentially. In understanding the way that from the initial temptation, the first sin, the fruit, resulted in man and woman, or also known as a coming together of forms of love. And understanding now that the fruit or a substance created a connection that resulted in what is now known as a form of love. Essentially, addiction is the moment that you have now generated that form of love through a substance, but now you take away that form of love. What you are then left with is the substance that results in you feeling what would feel the sensation of that form of love. Which now when you dive into addiction, you realize that the true root of addiction is actually the opposite or a spectrum of love. And I will dive into that as I progress into the video. But in understanding that it is now a replacement for love, it simply differs in which place you then experience the love. Because now you see, if you feel love in the physical reality, you would not feel yourself in your mental reality as much. But if you feel love in your mental reality, you don't feel yourself in the physical reality as much. And through the depth of addiction, we then begin to see the depths of the hard hitters of substances. Which now, imagine if, in essence, the harder I hit, technically the harder the form of love you would experience. If that is the idea behind the notion of the greater experience of a harder or more powerful level of consciousness resulting in the experience of love between partners. But now when we realize that the moment you remove the partner, you are then left with the addiction that resulted in you feeling the love of that particular individual. And into the further psychological analysis, as I dive further into the idea of the hard hitters of substances, which at that point I would argue, if you have to hit that hard at a substance, it is not actually love itself, just as much as it is love itself that you are seeking. Because that in itself stems from a deeper rooted problem to seek a harder hitting substance, which does not revolve around the love for a partner at that particular point. I will dive into that further. Now, as you start seeing the pathology of hard substance hitters, you then begin to see the harder they hit in the scale of the substance potency, that they start grooming other non-hard substance hitters because they have become, well, charming, manipulative. You could say they have a badness, a little devil to them, which gives them a little excitement, and it's exciting, it's fresh, and it's new. It's a form of puppy love, which is the first initial pull, which in itself results back to the innocence idea. The purest form of love is in itself the puppy form of love, because it's exciting. The problem in introducing a substance in order to be vulnerable, which is in itself an act of innocence, because now we see that humans, in their lack of ability to communicate between one another since the beginning of time, in order to feel a connection, we needed a substance, a fruit, a thing that allowed us to feel less judged by one another. And in the moment we felt less judged by one another, we also created the stunting of our innocence. Because the moment we then saw that from taking a substance, we then created a form of love we only feel based on that substance. And when you further change the hardness of the substance, you feel as though you're pursuing a better and better and better form of love. But in reality, you're completely destroying your life at that point. Because you see, if you were to care for physical reality, you would not care for the mental reality. And if you would care for the mental reality, you would not care for the physical reality. Which begs the question, at what point do we find the equilibrium? And at which point are we seeing now that drug addicts of hard-hitting substances are seeking to groom non-hard substance hitters, where they then not only use one particular person to become their new source of income to generate the continuation of their own self-predicament addiction, of their own self-love they're trying to fill, and they are doing it by abusing non-hard substance hitters, by taking them as prey, making them become a hard substance hitter by making them fall in love with the complex they have generated for themselves. And through the complex they have generated for themselves, not only do they seek one particular individual, they seek other individuals. Because see, just as a vampire, if you wish, if you were to sustain yourself in your essence or your ability to feed the addiction, a person would essentially go from partner to partner to partner. They would find and groom into their addiction so that they may feed continuously one after the other. And in this drug addicted state, we see that this actually happens at all levels and ages. Regardless of the hardness of a substance, The moment you introduce the level of addiction towards the feeling of love ignited by substance in order to get over the fear of the innocence, to be vulnerable in order to connect, we are seeing that there are some extremely troubled people out there, and that is not as a result of their partner love they're seeking to replace or still fulfill. That is as a result of a parental love they're seeking to fulfill. And the further you go into the parental issues, then you start seeing a darker and darker and darker and darker issue. The problem now is some of these problems are actually really superficial. And that's where we see a complexity in the mind of drug addicts. Because for the innocence of such a simple thing, they have created such a dark complex. Because that's what addiction is. It creates a feeding process that doesn't eat or cause you to feed off of others, but it simply causes you yourself to feed off and eat your own life away. In consuming your life away. That is the thing you're doing with addiction. The thing that now most people don't realize is addiction is actually an aspect of life that everybody deals with. It simply takes form in different patterns. And in those different patterns, you can identify healthy addiction and negative addiction. Such a thing as enjoying the passion of wanting to cook or be fit or go on adventures or go hiking or things that give a dopamine release, which are based on physical activity and physical reality. Things you achieve in this particular realm result in the same dopaminergic and serotonergic release, which you would then feel the same level of betterment in the essentially the point I'm trying to get to is the depth at which drug addiction has a certain potential beauty to it, but for the light it can illuminate comes a lot of darkness. And people don't realize the darkness they are messing with when they are entering that world of magic. We as a collective, as a society now, are feeding people's addictions in different provinces, states, if they have these social programs known as safe injection sites, where our taxpayer money collectively go as a whole in order to essentially feed or maintain the person's level of addiction where they are not, you could say, easily triggerable to the same degree they would want to, out of the craving, harm or rob or assault or gang up or whatever you name it, just particularly cause crime as a result of their drug addiction. And we are spending money in paying for these individuals to not receive treatment of fighting against the addiction, but treatment of keeping them in the addiction. Because that's how far gone some of these individuals are, and we see a lot of the homeless, not all, but a lot of the homeless on our streets in Canada, anyways, receive safe injection site treatment, keeping people on the street. And now we see that Canada is stepping into a different direction in the medical treatment now for people with suchly deeply rooted issues, whether it be parental issues, drug addiction issues, on and on and on and on. We're actively seeing that in Canada they created a system which was not just implemented for the terminally ill, but as well for the terminally insane. In Canada, we are seeing they are beginning to implement a structure of medically assisted suicide or death. Now we are seeing that we are no longer giving it to terminally ill elderly cancer patients to prevent them from suffering anymore, but we're beginning exploring the idea of giving these treatments to not just mentally ill patients, people that no longer have the ability to function within society, but we've begun also processing the idea of seeking to implement these types of treatments for individuals dealing with deep enough drug addiction. And so, for those that might vote in the leftist ideology now, may I make a point that if you see the idea of beauty of social programs, we should be giving a way for people to be rehabilitated at that point. Would you not agree? But to the same time, even liberals would say that doesn't belong in society, which begs the question, why introduce it into society in the first place? A paradox of sorts, and that was the initial grab that we are now doped up and hoped up on. Because we've all been basically getting stoned out of our gourds since the legalization. Not all. The few that are successful in Canada are not getting doped up all day long, if ever. And if you look at the true people that have begun the process of generating a new addiction, which in itself creates a stepping stone pattern for every step you want to take a further and further step. And these harder hitting substance hitters themselves know that. And so in the idea of the Canadian government introducing the legalization of a particular substance such as marijuana, in the idea of decriminalizing it was one particular fundamental idea, that you would not get in trouble if you had your own individual way of getting it for yourself. But now they legalized it to make it a revenue base for the government of Canada, which meant the Canadian government became the drug dealers. And in becoming the drug dealers, what ended up happening with the pharmaceutical industry? Mental illness arose, psychiatric treatment processes increased, because people were slowly developing psychosis. The rebalancing process of the flight of addiction, where you're now trying to land that spaceship, if you wish, your mind back to the ground. And when you get into the depth of that addiction, if you don't understand the reality of those that have brought you there, and you can't, in the goodness of your heart, simply make it aware in your psychoanalysis that if you dive into the realm of substances, this is a reality you are presenting yourself within if you continue down this pathway. And so where do you find the initial source of love reversing that entire process? Back at the innocence, which stems in your childhood, which means there is a moment in your childhood, something happened, and there was a perversion that stole your innocence, and the substance you now use is what allows you to feel the weight of that perversion lifted away from you, where now the patterns of negativity beyond the depth of the pathology that particular event caused, in the drug addiction that resulted in, and all of the other negative behaviors that created, you now see that the guilt you feel based around that particular event is also the exact guilt that is causing you to pursue the addiction of that particular event. But in that guilt, you must realize that that particular event as a child had nothing to do with you being in control. So how can it be your fault? And so you must learn to forgive yourself for that particular moment. You feel that kind of snap out of you. And the idea of a psychoanalysis of a drug addict, you are actively pulling the individual's consciousness out of the addiction, because you are creating the psychological awareness to their own individual consciousness, a way of hypnotic communication. It's the way you present the truth that allows the blade to only cut in one particular way, that gets rid of that particular pattern, that negative branch, that dead limb. And the dead limb stems when you use too much substances. What does that do to your nervous system? It causes it to fry up and die, and you then result in less and less and less of your own particular tree of knowledge being able to function healthily. But you can rehabilitate it. by giving it the sun and water. Anyways, folks, thank you for coming to my conversation on the psychoanalysis of the mentality of a drug addict. Thank you.